Chapter 4. Elaine dressed carefully for church the following morning. She wanted to look her best her first time in the new church. When she was ready, she stepped out of the bedroom, her hair piled atop her head with a few strands of curls falling down. When Colin looked up at her, he smiled. "You look beautiful." He walked over to her, kissing her softly. "I'm going to have to fight the other men off with a stick." He didn't say anything about it, but it was on his mind that tonight was the wedding night she promised him. He would be able to hold her and love her for the first time, and he was more than a little anxious. She smiled, shaking her head. "You're the only one who doesn't mind getting a broken woman." She couldn't believe he actually claimed he thought someone would try to steal her. Obviously, he was trying to spare her feelings. "You're not broken. You're special." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her passionately, trying to make her forget her feelings of inadequacy. Wishing John had chosen a night when she was more confident to stop by, he stroked her cheek softly. Elaine leaned against him, happy for his comfort when she was feeling down. "I hope the people in church are kind. So often everyone stares at the way I walk." She didn't care for herself, but she worried he would be embarrassed of her if too many people commented on it. "Let them. If they think less of you for it, then they're just plain stupid. You're a good person, and if they can't see that, they don't deserve your time." He smiled at her. "Do you want to eat at the restaurant in town today? That way you don't have to worry about hurrying home to cook." He preferred her cooking to the restaurant any day, but he wouldn't tell her that. He didn't want her to have to rush to cook that way. She nodded, thankful for the offer. "That would be really nice. I'd love to make chicken for supper. Would you mind killing one for me?" She was used to someone going to the butcher to bring home meat that was already prepared. Having to ask her husband to kill their supper was a new experience for her. He shook his head. "We have a pullet that's ready." "That sounds good. I'll make some fried chicken for supper tonight, and then boil the rest for chicken and dumplings tomorrow." How does that sound? She hoped he enjoyed chicken and dumplings, because it was one of her favorite meals and the first thing she'd ever learned to cook. "Like I'm going to get fat just thinking about your cooking, but I'm not going to mind one single bit." He grinned. "It's a good thing my job is so physical, or I'd be walking around as round as a ball within 6 months." He sighed. "It's so worth it." She laughed. "I'm glad you like my cooking. I'm sure that makes it worth it to be married to me." She was glad to have some redeeming qualities. He sighed. "I wish you could understand that you have nothing to make up for. I think you're perfect just the way you are. I wish you could see yourself through my eyes. I really do." How could she not see how special she was? She rested her head on his shoulder, hoping he still felt that way when he saw her bare leg. She was worried about it, because there were a lot of scars where the bone had poked through the skin. He was so handsome and so whole that she felt like he'd really settled for someone who wasn't as good as he could have married. "What time does church start?" He glanced at the clock over the mantel. She liked that he had both the cook stove and a fireplace, because she felt it made the house seem cozier. She was used to her big sprawling house in Beckham, but she was quickly adjusting to the size of their small house. "We need to leave. I want to get there a little early so I can introduce you around." He seemed genuinely proud of her. Elaine was pleased that he wasn't embarrassed for her to meet his friends. One of her big worries had always been being with someone who was embarrassed of her limp. It didn't seem to bother him at all. She was amazed by him, he really did seem to see her as more than a hurt leg. "Let's go then." He'd already hitched up the wagon and led her outside, carefully helping her into the wagon. Once she was seated, he ran around and got up as well, driving toward town. "You don't have to worry about seeing John at church," he told her. "I don't think he's been since he moved here." Elaine breathed deeply at that, truly relieved she wouldn't have to see the man that morning. I'm so happy I didn't marry him. I would have been miserable. She'd included in her letter to Elizabeth what John had been like, hoping the other woman wouldn't send another bride out to him. He wrapped his arm around her, holding the reins in his left hand. And I'd have been in jail. She looked at him in surprise. Why would you be in jail? What was he saying? Colin kissed her forehead. I'd have had to kill him the first time he mistreated you. She threw back her head and laughed. You wouldn't have thought about me twice if I'd married him. Are you sure about that? When I saw you walk into the restaurant with him, all I could think was that I hoped you weren't going to marry him. I wanted you for myself from the first moment I saw you. He shook his head. I'd have spent the rest of my life dreaming about the beautiful woman I'd missed out on. You did not. You married me because you felt sorry for me. He took a deep breath, trying not to get angry with her. No, I didn't. I hope someday you'll realize that I'm telling the truth about this. She looked down at her hands in her lap, feeling bad for not believing him, but how could she? No one had ever looked at her as if she was special. No one had really paid much attention to her except to tell her what she couldn't do since the day she'd fallen from the tree. She didn't believe there was anything worth looking at her twice for. Her cooking and cleaning would have to make up for what she was lacking physically. I'm sorry. He sighed. I know you believe what you believe, and there's no way I can change your opinions of me, but I did take one look at you and know I wanted you to be my wife. I hope you don't think that I'm calling you a liar, because I'm not. I can't see anyone looking at me and seeing someone that they want to marry. Especially with the way I'm sure I looked when I came into town on Friday. I was hurting, dirty, and really not at my best. She knew she had looked pitiful, and she couldn't believe he kept claiming to have fallen for her on sight. You were beautiful. Your hair was falling from your bun, and there were a few pieces that were clinging to your face. I could see that you were tired, but you kept your head high as John said some pretty ugly things to you. He kept his eyes on the road as they entered town. I wanted to hit him, but I was pretty sure it would upset you, so I kept my fists to myself. He wouldn't have for much longer, though. He knew that even if she didn't. You really wanted to hit him? She looked at him in surprise. No man had ever wanted to hit another man over her before. For some reason, it made her feel special. Colin looked at her in surprise. Of course I did. I was raised to respect women. All women. He sat there with the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen and treated her like she was inferior. Like she was some sort of damaged goods, because she had an injury that was clearly bothering her more than usual. He shook his head. I won't ever let anyone treat you that way again. If he ever says anything unkind to you, I will hit him. I don't care what you think about it. Elaine gaped at him for a moment as he stopped the wagon in front of a small church, set the brake and jumped down. Never in her life had she known someone who was willing to defend her so strongly. She asked herself once again what she had done in life to deserve such a good man. Thank you. He helped her down, ignoring her thanks. You need to take your cane in. I know you don't like it, but I don't want your leg to feel worse. He took it from where it rested at her feet and handed it back to her. She nodded. I will. I know it will be better for me to go ahead and use it. Colin led her into the church with her clinging to his arm with one hand and holding her cane in the other. He was pleased to see her using it, knowing it would be better for her in the long run. As they walked into the church, he introduced her to many of the people they passed. This is my wife, Elaine, he said over and over, his voice full of pride. One lady, close to Elaine's age, stopped and smiled. I'm so glad there's another woman my age around. When did you two marry? Friday, Elaine said with a smile, while the pretty redhead gasped. She liked her very much and hoped they could become friends. Friday? Really? I didn't even know that Colin was seeing anyone. Elaine shook her head. He wasn't. I was a mail-order bride. She didn't add that she was there to marry another man. She wasn't sure if she'd ever be ready to admit that aloud. Oh, really? I've read about mail-order brides, but never actually met one. Are you happy you did it? She seemed genuinely interested. Elaine looked up at Colin and grinned. Do you actually need to ask that? She reached for his hand and he took hers automatically. What was your name? Rebecca Armstrong. I'm married to Abel. He's up front talking to the preacher. Elaine looked at the man who was talking to the nice pastor who'd married her to Colin. He was mid-20s, with short blonde hair. What does he do? She asked. He's a wheat farmer. We live just a mile or two down the road from you and Colin. Maybe we could get together someday. It's not too far to walk. Rebecca seemed to genuinely like the idea of getting together with her. Elaine made a face. It would be a little too far for me. I'd love for you to come visit me though. I could make lunch for us. She held up her cane so the other woman would understand that she really couldn't walk that far. Rebecca nodded eagerly. That sounds wonderful. She eyed the cane in Elaine's hand. What happened to your leg anyway? Elaine told the story about falling from the tree. It just never grew after that, so my right leg is shorter than my left. I wish there was a way to fix it, but I have no idea what that way would be. She shrugged as if it didn't matter. It looks like you still get around well, and that's what really matters, Rebecca said, dismissing the injury. Elaine smiled. She liked Rebecca a lot and had from the moment she saw her, but her dismissal of her injury made her like her so much more. We're going to be good friends, she said. I can see it already. She couldn't wait to have the other woman over. Rebecca smiled. I can use a good friend. There aren't enough women in this area, and it seems as if there aren't any who are our age. She made a face. It's hard staring at the same four walls every day and not having anyone to talk to other than my husband. Well, I'm glad we'll have each other then. How long have you been married? 3 years. No children? Elaine asked. She'd assumed the other woman must be a newlywed like she was. Rebecca pointed across the church. Do you see a woman around 40 with a little girl in her arms? That's my mother and my little girl, Leah. Leah turned and waved to her mother then, and Rebecca waved back. Oh, she's beautiful. You'll bring her with you when you come for lunch? Leah had her father's blonde hair and looked to have light eyes, but it was hard to tell through the crowd. I'd love to, and Leah will be thrilled. Rebecca looked toward the front of the church as the pastor cleared his throat. We'll set up a day for Leah and I to walk over after the service. Impulsively she hugged Elaine. I can't wait to spend time with you. Elaine followed Colin, who led to a pew. You didn't have to stay with me, she whispered. I was fine. She didn't want him to feel like he had to be with her every moment they were in public. He could go and talk to his friends if that's what he wanted to do. He squeezed her hand with a grin. I like being beside you. She stood proudly beside him and shared his songbook as they sang the same hymns she'd been singing since childhood. She wasn't a good singer, but she made up for it with loudness and enthusiasm. Sitting quietly beside him, she did her best to listen to the sermon, but her mind was too busy thinking about all the new people around her in the church. She felt like she was finally being accepted for the first time since her accident. It was wonderful to have a new home. After the service, she and Rebecca met up, and she met Abel and Leah. Rebecca looked at Abel. Leah and I are going to walk over to the Monroe Ranch and have lunch with Elaine one day this week. Which day would work best for you? Abel looked at Colin and shook his head. I like that. This is what I'm going to do, but you may give your opinion about when I do it. What happened to the good old days when women knew their place? Colin shrugged with a grin. Elaine is still acting like everything I say matters. I give it another week or two before that stops. He ignored Elaine when she glared at him. Abel sighed. Enjoy it while you can. Rebecca looked at her husband. What day would be good? She wasn't going to listen to him complain about her disobedience by the look on her face. Wednesday? And what am I going to do for lunch while you're out running around the countryside with your new friend? I'll leave some soup on the stove for you. Rebecca looked back at Elaine. I swear, you'd think he would starve to death if I wasn't there to feed him every few hours. Elaine put her hand over her mouth to try to conceal her giggles. She loved the way the other couple interacted with each other. Will you come around noon? She asked, wanting to have everything ready. That sounds good, and you can plan on us staying for a few hours. I'll put Leah down to nap there, and we'll just spend some time getting to know each other. Elaine nodded happily. I'd love that. Mentally, she was going over all the things she wanted to have done before her friend arrived. She wanted to have the curtains on the windows and the tablecloth finished, and some nice fall flowers if she could find some. She would have to ask Colin if he knew where any were. Rebecca held up a hand in a wave as she walked toward the door. I'll see you on Wednesday then. My mother has us over for lunch every Sunday after church. It's nice not to have to cook one afternoon a week. This week, Elaine reminded her. That's right. 2 whole days where I only cook 2 meals per day. I hope I don't get spoiled and forget how to work, she joked as she walked toward the door at the back of the church. Elaine looked at Colin. What will you do for lunch on Wednesday? Should I pack you a sandwich to take with you? She was more than willing to do whatever he needed. Are you saying I'm not allowed to eat lunch with you and your friend? Are you embarrassed of me or something? He gave her a mock frown. She laughed. You know that's not true. I just don't think you'll enjoy listening to us talk about women's things. And honestly, she wanted time alone with her new friend. She started to bend over to get her cane, but he got it for her. There's no need for you to ever bend when I'm here. It's my job to take care of you. Elaine thanked him, accepting the cane from him. Her leg was tired, but it was not terribly painful. She took the arm he offered and walked with him out to the wagon, stopping to talk to the pastor at the door. Thank you for your sermon today. I really enjoyed it, she said. Pastor Samuel smiled. We're happy to have you as part of our congregation. I'm very happy to be here. She squeezed Colin's arm a bit tighter as she said the words. She couldn't believe just how quickly she'd gotten used to having him around and started relying on him so strongly. After he helped her into the wagon and climbed up himself, Colin turned to her. So how was our church compared to your church at home? He asked. She shrugged. It was the same but different. She laughed at herself for a moment. The service was pretty much exactly the same, but at home, I always had to sit between my parents, because my mother was certain if I didn't someone would bump into me and hurt me. She tried to think of the right way to say what was on her mind. I guess the biggest difference is that here I was allowed to be an adult, but at home I was always forced to be a child, no matter if I felt like one or not. So is it better to go to church as a child or as an adult? I'll take doing anything as your wife over doing it as a child any day of the week. She emphasized the word your so he would understand that being another man's wife wouldn't hold the same appeal. I'm glad. He kissed the top of her head as he left the churchyard and headed toward the house. I gave your letters to Mr. Judd, and he promised to get them mailed off first thing tomorrow. She smiled. Thank you. She looked down at her hands for a moment. I didn't tell my parents what happened when I arrived. I had never told them John's last name, so I just kept referring to you as my husband in the letter. I hope you don't mind. He thought about that for a moment as he navigated the busy roads. Well, did you not tell them because you were afraid they'd worry about you, or because you think you made a bad decision by marrying me? How can you even ask that? Of course, I was afraid they'd worry. My mother would be on the next train out here if she found out I'd married the wrong man. She hated the idea of her mother coming there and disturbing her new marriage. She knew eventually she'd see her again, but she wanted to be a great deal more confident in herself first. Did you marry the wrong man? He asked. For some reason, Colin had been worried that she regretted the decision to marry him and not go back home. He wasn't sure why, but the way she'd acted that morning when he'd talked about how glad he was to have her for his wife had bothered him a great deal. No, I didn't. But my mother wouldn't see it that way. My father would be proud that I figured out how to make things work without them, but mother would be crying and begging me to go back home. She frowned. I'm not going back. She couldn't even think about going back without wanting to cry. She hadn't realized how truly lonely and isolated she'd been until she'd arrived in Kansas. He put his arm around her, hugging her to him. No, you're not. You're mine now, and I'm keeping you. She smiled, liking his possessive tone. You don't have a choice unless you plan on kicking me out into the snow. It's October. There's no snow yet. I guess you're forced to keep me then, aren't you? He laughed. I guess I can make it through. He stopped beside the Missouri River that ran just north of town and not too far north of the ranch, which was already north of town. I love just sitting here watching the river. She smiled. I love to go to the beach back home. I could sit and watch the ocean for hours. You won't be able to do that here. Does that bother you? He hated that some of her favorite things wouldn't be possible in Kansas. She shook her head. I haven't gone for years. Not since before I hurt myself. She stared out at the water, feeling its calming influence wash over her. I feel like my whole life ended that day, and I've been waiting for years for it to start again. I know that sounds silly, but I've been fighting to be me again for 12 years. Well, then I guess I'm the luckiest man alive. I get to be the one to be there as you start to live again. She smiled as he started the wagon, so happy to have him beside her on the drive home. He really was a special man who looked at things in a different way than anyone she'd ever met. She needed him just as much as she'd ever needed anything. Chapter 5. They spent the day together, because he didn't work on Sundays. When I was growing up, my father said that the Lord's Day was for resting, and we were never allowed to work at all. The only work that was ever done was cooking and milking, but only because milking had to be done. Even when it was harvest time, we took all day off every single Sunday. My family wasn't as strict about it, Elaine said as she carefully hemmed the curtains. She really wanted to have them up and ready to go before Rebecca and Leah came to lunch Wednesday. Father never worked, but he had no problem if work was done around the house. Does it bother you if I sew? She didn't think sewing should be a problem, but she didn't want to upset him in any way. Oh, not at all. I just won't work on Sunday other than gathering eggs and milking the cows. I wanted to explain why. It always makes me feel a little lazy to take a whole day off every week. He grinned at her playfully as he sat with a book in his lap. She smiled. I think everyone should take a day off. It's good for us to have a time of rest. She nodded down at the curtains. I actually enjoy sewing, and I want this done before Wednesday. I can't stand to sit with idle hands. Her mother had drilled into her from a young age that you use what time you have to make things better. She couldn't count the number of pillows she'd embroidered over the years. When you're used to working, idle hands make you feel a bit crazy. He watched her as she sewed, wondering if she remembered their bargain, and realized tonight was the night for them to consummate the marriage. He hoped so, because he didn't want to have to try to convince her it was all right. She acted as if everything were normal, though, so he worried she'd forgotten. He'd been counting down the hours until bedtime, while she acted as if it were just another day. After supper, he went out to milk the cows and collect the eggs. He hoped she'd take the hint and get ready for bed early, because he was tired of waiting. When he stepped back into the house and put the milk and the eggs on the work table, she wasn't waiting for him in the main room as she usually was. He smiled a bit in relief, knowing he'd find her in the bedroom. He walked into their room and found her, already in her nightgown, waiting in bed for him. He blew out the lantern and undressed quickly, sliding beneath the covers with her. Lying on his side, he pulled her to him, noting that she'd left her hair down for the first time that night. Normally, she put it in a long braid down her back at night. He stroked her cheek, his hand going under her hair in the back and pulling her head toward him. He brushed his lips against hers, gently and sweetly, before smoothing her hair away from her face. "I love your hair," he told her. "Thank you for wearing it down for me. I thought you'd prefer it tonight." She knew he liked her hair with all the times he'd touched it. "I'd prefer it if you wore it down all the time, but I know that's not practical." She shook her head. "If I wore my hair down all the time, it would end up in everything we eat. It would always be in the way." She kissed his chin. "But I don't mind wearing it down in bed at night if that's what you'd like me to do." "I'd love that," he told her. "Please do." Her hair was incredibly provocative to him, and all he could think about was how it would feel against his bare skin. His lips toyed with hers as he stroked his hand down her side and over to cup her breast in his hand. It felt strange to have someone touching her there. Her mother hadn't told her that would happen, and she'd never even considered men would be interested in a woman's breasts. She thought they were solely for feeding babies. It felt good though, so she didn't ask him to stop. "I'm going to try not to hurt you, so you need to let me know if I do anything that bothers you. You know the first time will hurt, don't you?" She nodded, blushing. "Mother said that men enjoy it, though, so I need to not scream and put up with the pain." She had been mentally bracing herself for days for this to happen, and she thought she might finally be ready. He chuckled. "I hope it's not as bad as all that. Women are supposed to enjoy it, too." He hoped she wasn't too afraid to enjoy herself. "Really? Mother said women tolerate it while men want to do it all the time. Your mother, she's not someone I want to meet anytime soon." She grinned. "She's really not as bad as I make her sound." She put her hand on his shoulder. She'd been wanting to touch his chest since their first night in bed together. "Am I allowed to touch you?" she asked, wondering just what she should and shouldn't do. "Do you want to?" He loved the idea of her touching him, but he didn't want her to do anything she didn't want to do. She nodded. "I've been wanting to touch your chest since the first night. Is that okay?" She knew it wasn't something she should admit, but she just didn't care. She wanted to touch him, and that's all there was to it. He smiled, kissing her softly. "Of course, it's okay. We're married. What we do together is all right as long as both of us like it. So if I don't like any of this, we won't do it again," she teased. He groaned. "If you don't like it after a few times, we'll do it less. I can't promise never again." He ran his hand around to her back, stroking it gently. "You want children, don't you?" "Yes, and this is how we get them." Elaine stroked her hand down his chest and over his nipple. When he sucked in a breath, her fingers returned to his nipple, toying with it. "You like that?" she asked, surprised. "I do. I like having your hands on me." He closed his eyes and just enjoyed her soft hands against him. His chest was smooth and hard, and she loved how it felt under her fingers. She felt herself tingling all over as she touched him, and she was growing uncomfortable between her legs. Not really a pain, but more of a restless feeling. When she moved a little on the bed, he asked, "Am I hurting you? Is this painful?" He didn't know how he'd stop, but if he was hurting her, he would without hesitation. She shook her head. "No, I just feel strange." She couldn't explain it to him better than that. "What do you mean?" She blushed, wondering how to tell him where she felt funny. "I'd rather not say." He frowned. "You can tell me anything. I'm your husband." He hated the idea of her keeping secrets from him, and if he was hurting her in any way, he needed to know about it. "Not this." She shook her head, refusing to tell him. "What feels strange?" He was worried that it was something he was doing wrong, and he wouldn't hurt her for anything. She whispered, even though she knew no one could hear them. "Between my legs. I feel strange." She knew her face was flaming red, and she was glad the room was mostly dark, so he couldn't see her blushes. He stifled a laugh as he kissed her forehead, his hand going down her hip to her thigh. "That's a good thing. It means you like what we're doing." "It does?" Her mother hadn't mentioned that would happen. "Definitely." His hand caught the hem of her nightgown and started to pull it up. "I want to take this off you." "Please don't." She couldn't bear for him to see her naked. "Why not?" "I want to see you." He understood she was shy, but this seemed to be more than that. "I'm not ready for you to see my leg. Can you just move it out of the way?" She was more than willing to follow through with this, but she couldn't let him see her that way. He sighed. "It won't bother me to see." "Please." She knew her leg wasn't pretty, and she didn't want to see disgust in his eyes when he looked at her. He kissed her softly. "I won't take it off if you don't want me to." His fingers went to the buttons at the front of her nightgown, which went from her neckline to her waist. "I'm going to unbutton you so I can touch your skin, though." The thought of his fingers on her breasts made her tingle more. "I think I'd like that." She stayed silent as he unbuttoned each of the buttons, his hands parting the fabric and one of them slipping inside to stroke her soft skin. She let out a low moan when he caught her nipple between his thumb and forefinger and rolled it softly. "That feels good," she whispered. He smiled, leaning down to capture her other nipple with his lips, tugging it into his mouth and suckling her, his tongue moving back and forth against her nipple, causing her to thrash under him. He released her nipple and pressed his lips against hers. "You taste so good to me." She clutched his shoulders in her hands, feeling odd as he rested on his forearm over her, his lips brushing against her bare chest. "It's so strange letting someone touch me this way." Her voice was a mere whisper. "But do you like it?" he asked. He needed her to enjoy what they were doing together. "I do. I just keep expecting my mother to walk in and tell me to stop at any second." She knew it was crazy, but that's what she kept thinking about. Her mother would love to interrupt her doing anything she was enjoying. He laughed. "Your mother isn't here, sweetheart. It's just you and me. Learning together." His hand went to the hem of her nightgown and dragged it up over her waist, his hand going to the juncture between her thighs. He moved one finger along her crease, sliding it inside her deeply. She gripped his shoulders tightly, her eyes widening as she felt his finger inside her. Was what he was doing all right? After a moment she stopped worrying about what her mother would think and just enjoyed the sensations as he carefully moved his finger in and out of her body. "That feels nice." He breathed a sigh of relief. She was going to enjoy this after all. He removed his finger and rolled atop her, moving one hand down to guide him to her entrance. His lips pressed against hers as he pushed inside her, swallowing her slight gasp of pain with his kiss. Afterward, he laid on his side holding her close, both of them panting. That was more than I expected, she said, kissing his shoulder. He gathered her closer, kissing the top of her head. Honestly, it was more than I expected as well. He sighed happily. How did I get so lucky to walk into a restaurant and find you there? Elaine laughed. I'm the lucky one. She snuggled into him, her head on his shoulder, happy to just be with him. She yawned loudly, closing her eyes. Her mother had scared her about this, but she loved it. Life was certainly better away from Beckham. Elaine was surprised by how nervous she was about Rebecca and Leah coming over the following morning. Everything was cleaned as well as she could do it, and she planned to ask her friend if she knew of someone who would be willing to scrub her floors for her. She made a cake to go with the tea she planned to serve for an afternoon snack, and fixed a simple meal for the three of them. When Rebecca arrived, she dried her hands nervously on her apron and looked around the room to make certain it was ready for her guests. Her curtains were hanging at the windows, and the tablecloth looked good on the table. Colin had picked some flowers for her, and they were in a glass in the center of the table. She made a mental note to buy a vase the next time they went to town. She liked the idea of having one, and Colin had said he didn't care what she spent her money on. She opened the door to her new friend, inviting her inside. I'm so glad you were able to come for lunch today, Elaine told her. Rebecca smiled, setting Leah on the floor. Thank you for inviting us. She looked around the small house. I was never here before, but I can see you've definitely put your touch on the place. I'm sure Colin didn't have curtains before you arrived. Elaine smiled. No, he had furniture and a stove, and that's about it. She laughed with her friend about the difference in how a man set up house and how a woman did. That sounds like how my husband was when we married. Rebecca hurried across the room and grabbed Leah's hand. Don't pull the tablecloth off the table. The two women chatted while they ate the simple meal Elaine had prepared. I moved out here with my family when I was 12. We lived back in the old states before that. Old states? Elaine asked, never having heard the term. Rebecca smiled. That's a term you need to get used to living in the West. It means all the East Coast states. Elaine grinned. What state are you from? My parents were factory workers in New York City when they heard about land grants here in Kansas, so they joined a wagon train. It was a tough journey, but I'm so glad we made it. I met Abel on the journey. He was a couple of years older than me, and he was part of the same wagon train. His family was from New York too. Rebecca shook her head. No, they were from New Jersey. She shrugged. Close enough, though. Our families remained close once we got here, and we ended up married. Did you have feelings for him right away? Elaine asked, still trying to come to grips with what she felt for Colin. She knew she was falling in love with him, but she had no idea how he felt about her. Sure, he'd claimed to love her, but she knew he just felt sorry for her. Rebecca seemed to think about that for a moment. I thought he was annoying when I first met him. He kept trying to act like he knew everything to impress me. Once he stopped that nonsense, we became friends, and eventually, we fell in love. She gave Leah another piece of bread. What about you? Did you look at Colin and know he was the one for you? Elaine shook her head. Not immediately. I was attracted to him right away, but I don't think I knew that I had feelings for him for a while. Not until he kissed me in the alley in town. She blushed as soon as the words escaped her mouth. He kissed you in an alley? Do tell. Elaine laughed. I tried to get him to shake on an agreement we made before we went to the pastor to marry. He refused to shake, but dragged me off into an alley and kissed me instead. I'm not sure what he was thinking. She'd never been in a relationship with a man before Colin, so she didn't know if things like that were normal. Rebecca laughed. If he's like most men, he was thinking he didn't want to wait to get his hands on you. He's a nice man and well regarded around town. Elaine took a sip of her water. I also met John Black. What do you think of him? She knew Colin's opinion of the man, but she'd love to hear what another woman thought of him. Just be glad you didn't come here to marry him. He told everyone he'd send off for a mail-order bride. Rebecca shuddered delicately. You'd have had to turn tail and get back east as soon as possible. He's not a pleasant man. I got that impression. He likes to stop in here for a free meal whenever he feels like it. Elaine shook her head, debating telling the other woman about how she was supposed to be John's bride, but he'd rejected her. I'd avoid him if you can. Can Colin tell him not to come by anymore? Is he dangerous? Elaine asked in surprise. She had gotten the impression he was not a pleasant person, but not that he was dangerous. Rebecca frowned. I don't know if dangerous is the right word, but he makes me very uncomfortable. I think he only bathes twice a year, and he acts as if he knows everything. I don't really know what to say except that I would keep my distance. Elaine nodded. Thanks for telling me what you think. She knew she'd be thinking a lot about what the other woman had told her about John. He made her very uncomfortable. They changed the subject to easier topics as they finished eating and did the dishes together. After lunch, they sat at the table together to talk, each with a cup of tea and a piece of the cake Elaine had baked. I have a question for you. I need to hire someone to scrub my floors once a week. It's something my bad leg just won't allow me to do on my own. Do you know of anyone who would be willing? Rebecca thought about it for a moment. My younger sister, Laura, just got married last month, and they're having trouble making ends meet. I think she'd be thrilled for some extra money. Do you want me to ask her for you? Oh, yes, please. I'm happy to pay a fair wage for it. I can do everything except that so far. I'm sure I'll run into more things that are hard for me as time goes by, though. Elaine shook her head. I feel like I'm failing as a wife, because I can't do something as simple as scrub my floors. She knew the other woman would understand why she felt like a failure better than Colin did. Rebecca shook her head. I saw the way Colin was looking at you on Sunday. He certainly doesn't think you're failing as a wife. He's very happy with you. Elaine smiled. He overlooks my weaknesses. What more could a woman ask for in a husband? All of us have weaknesses. Rebecca looked at her plate for a moment. I can't bake for anything. My mother was a terrible baker, and she was never able to teach me to do it well. I burn the bread half the time, and my cakes are never worth eating. Elaine was startled. Oh, I'm certain that's not true. You probably cook like a dream. She couldn't imagine the woman sitting across from her not doing everything she attempted well. Oh, I do. I just don't bake well. Not that Abel complains. He says he married me because he loves me, not because I bake bread well. Rebecca shrugged. I hate it, but what can I do? Would you like me to teach you? We could bake some bread this afternoon, and you could take some home with you. I was going to bake bread in the morning, and this will give me a head start. Elaine loved the idea of being able to do something nice for the other woman. She felt like she'd done so much for her by recommending someone to clean her floors and walking 2 miles with a child to have lunch with her. Oh, I couldn't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. Elaine stood up. Here, let me show you. She pulled down the ingredients and spent the next 2 hours showing the other woman how to properly knead dough and how long to let it rise. When they were finished, Rebecca had 2 perfect loaves of bread to take home with her, and Elaine still had 2 for herself. When Leah woke from her nap in a strange place, she cried for a minute before getting down from the bed and wandering into the main room with Elaine and her mother. Elaine gave her a piece of cake, which she ate quickly. More cake? Leah asked. Rebecca sighed. She never asks for more of my cake. Elaine chuckled. The next time you come over, we'll bake a cake together. That way you can learn that too. She knew the other woman would need to leave soon, so she cut what was left of the cake in half, putting some on a plate with a bowl upside down over it to keep it fresh for herself and Colin. She handed the cake pan to Rebecca. Take this home with you. I have another cake pan, so if you return this on Sunday, it will be fine. Rebecca seemed to go through an internal debate before she took it. I don't know how I'm going to get all these goodies home, but I'm going to do my best. Elaine put the 2 loaves of bread in a basket after wrapping a towel around them. Here, this will help. She looked at Leah. If you can carry the basket for your mama, then she can take the cake home. Can you do that? She was pleased to be able to offer such a simple solution. Leah's face lit up. More cake? Yes, you can take cake with you if you can carry the basket. Elaine was enchanted by the pretty little girl and her excitement over the cake. Leah nodded solemnly. I carry. Good girl. Elaine grinned at Rebecca. Problem solved. I'm going to see my sister for a few minutes tomorrow afternoon. I'll tell her you want to hire someone to scrub your floors and have her come by to talk to you about it. Rebecca helped her daughter down from the chair she was sitting on, padded by pillows to make her tall enough. Thank you so much for the baked goods and teaching me to make bread. I'm going to really surprise Abel the next time I bake bread for him. I hope so, Elaine told her friend. I think it'll be a good surprise. She knew that it was hard enough being a wife without worrying that you weren't doing something well enough. I know it will. Rebecca took Leah's hand and the 2 of them left the house. Elaine watched them go for a moment before she went back in to wash the dishes they'd dirtied with their cake and tea. She was so glad to have found a friend. It had been years since she'd really been able to spend time with a friend. Rebecca was going to be good for her, and she was thrilled to be able to say it. Colin looked sadly at what was left of the cake when he got in that afternoon. You ladies ate all of that cake? He asked. Elaine laughed. No, we didn't. I sent half the cake home with Rebecca. She couldn't believe he looked so sad about the cake, like a little boy whose treat had been taken away from him. He gave her a forlorn look, obviously not happy with that answer. Why would you do that to me? She walked to him and kissed him softly. Rebecca doesn't know how to bake. I taught her to bake bread today, and I sent her home with half the cake. I'll bake you another one tomorrow. She frowned. Actually, I'm going to need to go into town again within the next couple of days for more supplies. Especially if she was going to be giving baking lessons, she would need to make sure she had extra flour and sugar and lard around. I'll take you tomorrow if you want. He wasn't about to let her run out of the ingredients she needed to make his sweets. That would be really nice if you don't mind. She set dinner on the table in front of him, and he smiled. I don't mind at all. We'll go right after breakfast. He waited until she was seated and prayed for them both. Did you have a good time with Rebecca today? He asked. She nodded. I had a really good time. I enjoyed having something that I was good at that I could help her with, and she said her sister needs extra money and would probably be willing to scrub the floors for me. She was pleased to be able to offer him the solution she and Rebecca had come up with. Oh, good. That will take a load off your mind. He was happy that she seemed happy about it. He hated that she got so upset over little things that she couldn't help. Yes, it will. She helped me see that I'm not the only one who isn't a perfect wife, though. She sighed, toying with her food for a moment. I felt like I was really lacking because I couldn't scrub the floor myself. I was embarrassed to ask her if she knew anyone, But then she admitted that she couldn't bake worth anything, and that made me feel better. It had done a great deal for her confidence level to help the other woman with her baking as well. If she was better at even one thing, then she was doing well. Trust me. I'd rather have a woman who could cook and bake like you do any day than a woman who can scrub the floors. The floor has nothing to do with how good my food tastes. Elaine hadn't really thought of it that way. I'm glad you think that way. Of course, I do. She said she thinks I should stay away from John. She is uncomfortable around him. She was getting more and more nervous about John every day, but she just wasn't certain why. Colin nodded as he thought about it. He didn't like the idea of her being around him when he wasn't there. I agree with that. If I'm not here, don't even go to the door if he comes over. I don't want you to be alone with him at all. He's just not a good man. He had nothing specific that had happened to make him feel that way, other than the way he'd seen the other man treat Elaine, but he knew he didn't trust him. I won't. She would probably hide from him if he came, which wasn't the best solution, but he frightened her. She got a vase in town the next day and found the things she still needed for cooking. She hadn't realized just how sparsely his kitchen was equipped, so she had a better idea what she needed now. As she shopped, he talked to Mr. Judd. She heard snatches of conversation floating back to her. She cooks like a dream. It really was my lucky day when I found her in the restaurant. She's a pretty one and seems like a hard worker. You could do worse. Elaine smiled at the compliments, carefully choosing what she wanted for her home. She wanted to make a new thicker winter quilt before the cold weather set in, so she purchased all the fabric she'd need for that. The quilt he had was made by his mother and already starting to come apart after many years of usage. She loved the idea of the two of them sharing a quilt she'd made with her own hands. She wanted to be able to do everything for him, not because he expected it of her, but because it pleased her to do so. After shopping, he took her to the restaurant for lunch to give her a break from cooking. When she protested she didn't need a break, he just smiled and led her into the restaurant. As they ate, she watched the people around them. She wished there were more people she recognized, but she knew that would come with time. I like Kansas City, she told him. It seems like a really nice place. She'd never felt as comfortable in Beckham as she did in Kansas. I do too. I moved here for the land the government gave me, of course, but now that I've been here for a while, I couldn't be happier with the people. Everyone is friendly and helpful. He frowned. Well, most everyone. John walked in then and caught Colin's eye. He tried not to draw attention to the other man, hoping Elaine wouldn't notice him, but John walked to their table. Well, if it isn't the lovebirds. Elaine nodded to the man and continued eating, not wanting to have a full conversation with him. Colin met the other man's eyes. What do you want, John? I'm just being friendly. John looked at Elaine. I sent another letter to Miss Miller. Told her that this time I want a girl who can cook and clean, who isn't broken. Colin got to his feet. I will not let you talk to my wife that way. He couldn't believe that John was still trying to belittle Elaine even though there was no need for him to ever speak with her. John glared at the other man before turning on his heel and leaving the restaurant without eating. I sent Elizabeth a letter about what happened when I got here, she told Colin. I don't think she'll match him up with another bride. She had been very honest about the way John had spoken to her and how he'd refused to marry her. She knew Elizabeth wouldn't be happy at all to have one of her brides treated that way by the man she was supposed to marry. Who is Elizabeth? He hadn't heard Elaine mention her before. Elaine explained quickly about the mail-order bride service and how it was Elizabeth Miller who ran it and sent the brides out. She was really sweet, but I never got a chance to know her well. She wished she'd been able to take the time to become friends with the other woman now that she was too far away to do it. She'd been very kind to her. And you don't think she'll send another bride out to him? Elaine shook her head. Elizabeth feels really strongly about not sending women into bad situations. She does a bit of a background check on every man, although I'm not certain how John passed. She knew for a fact that Elizabeth wouldn't send another woman out to be mistreated by John. Colin looked at her for a moment. Do you know how to use a shotgun? He asked. He wasn't sure why, but he was worried she'd be in danger at the house if John found out he wouldn't be able to get a bride from the agency. He was going to follow his gut, though, and make sure that she was safe. No. My mother felt that guns were only for men's use, because women had no idea how to really use them safely. She'd never liked guns, but she wasn't afraid of them. She liked the idea of being able to use one. Colin sighed. Your mother has some ridiculous ideas. Do you have any brothers? He couldn't believe he'd never asked that of her before. Why didn't he know more about his wife's past? No, just 4 sisters. She was certain if she'd had a brother her life would have been different. She should have had at least one boy. He took a bite of his pot roast. I want to teach you how to shoot. If John comes after you, and I'm not home, I won't leave you defenseless. He watched her for a reaction to his suggestion. Elaine contemplated that for a moment. I could never point a gun at anyone. She knew she'd never be able to live with herself if she had to shoot someone, no matter how badly they'd treated her. You may need to. We'll practice some and hope it never comes to that. His tone of voice let her know that he wasn't going to accept any kind of argument on the matter. He'd made his decision, and she needed to listen to him for a change. She made a face and finally nodded. All right. I'll learn. She wouldn't be happy about it, though. He started her lessons the following afternoon. At first, she enjoyed them, because he stood behind her with his arms around her, helping her hold the gun steady as she learned to aim. With a shotgun, a large number of pellets are shot at the same time, so you have a better chance of hitting your target. With a rifle or a pistol, it's only one bullet at a time. He wanted her to use the shotgun to give her a better chance of hitting her target. I see, she said, snuggling back against him with her back pressed to his chest. Shooting lessons are fun. She rubbed her backside against him suggestively. He let out a bark of laughter. You need to behave. He helped her hold the gun steady. I want you to aim for that branch on the tree there. He pointed to a tree that was not too far in front of them. She closed her eyes and squeezed the trigger, and she would have stumbled backwards if he hadn't been pressed so close against her. Her shoulder where the gun was pressed against it hurt a great deal. I don't like this. The kick of the gun was too powerful. She was certain if she ever tried to shoot without him standing behind her, she'd be knocked on her backside. He sighed. I know it hurts, but you have to be able to do it. I won't feel like I can work unless I know you know how to handle a gun. She nodded. I'll learn. I promise. As she got ready for bed that evening, she noticed a huge bruise on her right shoulder where she'd braced the shotgun. She rubbed it, groaning at the ache. After climbing into bed, she laid quietly under the covers, waiting for him to join her. My shoulder is all bruised, she told him as he undressed in the dark. Shotguns have a real kick. I don't think you could do as well with a pistol, though. He was worried that she wouldn't have good enough aim for a pistol. Aim didn't matter as much with a shotgun. He gathered her to him, being careful of her sore shoulder. We'll take tomorrow off, and try again on Saturday after church. He hated that his lessons had hurt her, but he knew it was necessary. She snuggled close, putting her head on his shoulder. I should feel well enough by then. Do you really think all of this is necessary? She asked. She'd spent the day with the gun, already loaded, propped against the corner of the wall and work table. Colin had said he needed to know she had it close so she could stay safe. He was silent for a long time before answering, trying to think of the best way to say it. I really hope not. But yes, he thought she'd need it. He just couldn't say the words aloud. Elaine sighed, her eyes closing. Me too. Rebecca's sister, Laura, was there Monday morning to scrub her floors. Elaine thanked the other woman profusely for being willing to take the time to come out and help her. She didn't feel like the woman asked for enough money for her time, but she didn't argue. It took her less than an hour to do the entire job. After she was finished, Elaine served them tea and cookies. Oh, these are good. Rebecca told me you were really good at baking. Laura took a second bite of the cookie and smiled down at it. I need to learn to bake like his. Well, I'm going to be giving Rebecca baking lessons every Wednesday afternoon for a while. You're welcome to join us. She nodded to the work table where there was a basket covered with a cloth. I did bake you a loaf of bread and some cookies to take home with you. She wanted to do something nice for the woman after the way she'd helped her. Laura smiled and nodded. Thank you so much. I'll talk to Rebecca and see if she'd mind sharing lessons with me. I'd invite our ma as well, but I don't think that woman will ever learn. I don't think my mother has ever cooked a meal in her life, let alone baked a cake. I used to sneak into the kitchen at home and get lessons from our cook, Mrs. Jenkins. Elaine's face lit up just at the mention of her old mentor. She missed her a great deal and decided she'd have to write her a letter the first chance she got. You had a cook? You grew up very differently than I did. Elaine smiled. Having a lot of wealth isn't always a good thing. You think so until you have it, and you realize that you're not any happier than anyone else. She knew most people were convinced that great wealth would make them happy, but she hadn't grown up very unhappy. After they finished their tea, Laura helped with the dishes and took her bread and cookies with her. I'll talk to Rebecca and see if it's okay if I come back on Wednesday, she said. If not, I'll see you at church on Sunday. Elaine was thrilled with the job the other woman had done, and when Colin came home for lunch, he commented on how good everything looked. Laura came to do the floors today? He needed to make certain Elaine hadn't hurt herself doing it. She nodded. She did a great job, didn't she? She put the soup she'd made for their lunch onto the table and sat down with Colin. Do we have to do another shooting lesson today? She dreaded the lessons because they always left her feeling so sore. He shook his head. If we were using a rifle, I'd have to do several more lessons with you, but with a shotgun, I think you're fine. I'll just make sure that I keep the shotgun loaded. Your aim is good enough that I'm not worried any longer. She nodded, smiling. I'm so glad that's done. I hope I never have to shoot another gun. She was happy to see it leaning against the wall, though, knowing it was loaded and ready to be used. He smiled. So do I. I'll feel better while I'm working knowing that you can shoot one, though. They settled into a routine after that. Every Wednesday Laura and Rebecca came alone with little Leah for lunch. While the little girl was sleeping, the three women would bake. She had both of them making basic breads and cakes by their second lesson. Why did Ma always say this was so difficult? Laura asked Rebecca. Rebecca shrugged. I have no idea. I actually enjoy it. She looked at her younger sister with a grin. We're going to have to start taking turns taking baked goods over for Pa, you know. Laura made a face. I know. Pa says he likes her bread, but how could anyone like it? It's always hard as a rock and usually burnt to boot. I'll take her some tomorrow morning, but you have to take something by on Saturday. Rebecca gave Laura the older sister look that Elaine had gotten many times from her older sisters, and she was sure she'd given it to her younger sisters as well. The look was universal. I will. Laura obviously wasn't looking forward to it, though. Do you want to work on cookies next week? Elaine asked them. She was surprised at just how much she was enjoying giving the other women baking lessons. For once, she felt like she was better at doing something than other women, and it made her feel like she was competent. Sounds good, Rebecca said. I know that Leah loves your cookies. She looked at the counter where there was a basket full of cookies waiting for each of the women to take home with them. They each had a cake pan as well. Laura lived in town, so she'd driven out to get Rebecca and Leah and drive them to Elaine's because it was getting colder. Are you going to have Thanksgiving with your mother? Elaine asked. She hated the idea of Thanksgiving with only 2 people. She was used to her mother's house that was always bursting at the seams on the holiday. It was the one holiday every year where all of the servants had brought their families, and her older sisters came home with their families for the special meal. It would seem very quiet with just her and Colin. Yes, we always do, Rebecca replied. You and Colin should join us. Mother won't mind. There's plenty of room, and you could actually bring some pies that would be fit to eat. Laura nodded emphatically. Oh, yes. We'd love to have the 2 of you there. Elaine thought about it for a moment. She loved the idea of being with a big group for the holiday, but she wasn't sure how Colin would feel. They hadn't talked about it at all. I'll ask Colin. She hoped he'd agree to the special meal with the sisters' family, but she wasn't certain, and didn't feel like she should speak for him. Oh, you know he'll do anything to make you happy, Rebecca said. I've never seen a man more in love with his wife. What? No. He just married me because... Elaine let her voice trail off. They thought she'd come out as a mail-order bride for Colin, and she didn't want to disillusion either of them. Because you stepped off the train and he thought you were beautiful? Laura asked. Because he loves you? Rebecca suggested. Elaine shook her head, looking back and forth between the 2 women. No, he doesn't love me. She sat down at the table and sighed. He married me because he felt sorry for me. You see, I came out here to marry John Black, and John took one look at my limp, and he told me to go back where I came from. She said the words quickly to get them out, hating that she still felt as if she'd done something wrong. Rebecca shook her head. He did not. Elaine shrugged. He did. Colin was sitting at the table next to us in the restaurant when I was talking to John about my injury, and he came over after John stormed out. He asked me to marry him. I know he really did want a wife who could cook. Anyone can see that, but also, he just felt sorry for me after he saw the way John rejected me. She felt better getting that off her chest. She'd felt like she was deceiving her friends for a long time, and she didn't have to any longer. Rebecca sat down across from Elaine, taking her hand in hers. I'm sure that's not what it was at all. You're a beautiful woman, and I'm sure he looked at you and all he could think about was being your husband. She shook her head. I've seen the way he looks at you, Elaine. That man is very much in love. He's just a good actor and doesn't want to embarrass me in front of the whole town. Elaine wished there were more between her and Colin, but she was certain he felt nothing for her, and she couldn't let her friends think otherwise. Laura sat down beside Elaine. You can't really believe that. His love shows clearly on his face. Stop worrying about it. I'm sure he'll tell you soon. Elaine shrugged. Well, he said that he fell in love with me at first sight, but no man would fall in love with a woman who walks like I do. Why was she having to convince them of the truth? Couldn't they see it with their own eyes? Rebecca stared at Elaine in shock. You really believe that, don't you? At Elaine's nod, she continued. Elaine, he truly does love you. Colin is not a liar. Everything about him is admired by the entire town. He's the most honest man I know. He's also the most kind-hearted and would never hurt a woman by telling her the truth about why he married her. Elaine stood and walked to the sink to start the few dishes they'd dirtied during their baking lesson. Rebecca joined her at the sink, obviously not knowing what to say to Elaine any longer. She dried the dishes as Elaine washed them while Laura tended to Leah, who had woken up. Before they left, Rebecca hugged Elaine tightly. "Talk to Colin about Thanksgiving. We'd love to have you there." Elaine nodded. "I will. I'd like to be there." She would do her best to get Colin to agree, because it wouldn't really feel like they were celebrating the holiday with just the two of them. Colin took her into town for supplies the next day, and they stopped at the post office to see if any mail had arrived for either of them. Colin had written home about marrying, and Elaine was still waiting to hear back from both Elizabeth and her parents. Colin handed her 2 letters as they stepped out of the post office, and looking at the handwriting on both, she decided to wait until she got home to read them. She was certain one was from Elizabeth, but the other was obviously from her mother. She needed to be alone to read a letter from her mother. After spending a few minutes in the general store, they drove home, eating the picnic lunch Elaine had packed for them beside the Missouri River. Colin spread one of the quilts his mother had made him out on the ground, and she put the picnic basket on it, opening it to serve them both fried chicken and potato salad. She also had a large flask filled with lemonade for them. "It's so peaceful here," she said to Colin, smiling at the river as the waves lapped at the banks. "I can see why you like it." The waves were very calming for her. He nodded. "I could sit here all day, but then the fences wouldn't get mended and the cattle wouldn't be moved to a new pasture. And you wouldn't have anything to eat for supper." She laughed at the look on his face at her words. She'd never met a man who liked to eat quite as much as Colin did. He looked at her in mock shock. "You need to make sure you have enough time to feed me, woman. I've heard the saying that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. I'm certain that's true in your case." She couldn't help but tease him over his love for food. He caught her hand in his and raised it to his lips. "You already have my heart, but please don't stop cooking." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry at his words. He couldn't joke about her having his heart, when they both knew he had no real feelings for her. "I won't stop cooking. I like how excited you get when you eat too much for that." She really did enjoy cooking for him, because he was so genuinely happy every time he came in the door and smelled dinner cooking. "You're a good wife." She shrugged. "I try to be, but I'm not sure how close I come to succeeding." She wished she was a better wife with everything inside her. "I can't believe you even worry about that. You know that I think you're absolutely wonderful." Colin toyed with the hand he still held in his lap, nodding toward the road. "If we weren't in such a public place, I'd show you how wonderful I think you are." His eyes told her what was on his mind, and she blushed. "I think you've shown me that once or twice." "Only once or twice? I'll have to try harder." He grinned with the same boyish grin that had caught her attention the day they'd met. "Who were the letters from?" She shrugged. "One is from my mother, and the other is from Elizabeth, the one who runs the mail-order bride agency." She was doing her best not to think about the contents of those letters. "You're not going to read them?" He was surprised she hadn't torn into them as soon as they were in her hand, which is what he did when he got a letter from home. "When we get home. I'm not sure what to expect from Mother's letter, so I'd rather be alone when I read it." She looked out over the river, trying to act as if it didn't matter to her. He frowned. "You don't think it will be a good letter?" "I really have no idea. She didn't want me to come here, so I can only guess it's going to be pretty negative." She looked down at the chicken in her hand. "I almost don't want to read it, but she's my mother. She'd always given her everything she needed, and she'd made it very clear that she loved all her daughters. She'd just smothered her more than she could handle. "Do you want me to read it first?" He hated that she was so nervous about a letter from home. He would do anything to help her with it. She shook her head. "If it's as negative as I think it'll be, I don't want you to see it." She smiled. "There's no reason to drag you into my family's craziness." Her words were light-hearted, but he could see the sadness in her eyes. He frowned. "Let me know if you change your mind." Once they were home and he'd carried everything in from the wagon, he kissed her gently. "Do you want me to wait while you read it?" he asked, knowing she'd read the letters as soon as he left. She shook her head. "I can handle it." She watched him as he left to go back to work and sat down at the table with her 2 letters. She opened Elizabeth's first, because she knew it would be easier for her to read. "Dear Elaine, thanks for writing me to let me know you're all right. I'm so glad Colin came along and asked you to be his wife. My heart went out to you about what you said about John Black. He will not be matched with a bride through my agency. There's no way I could send a bride out there in good conscience. I'm very thankful that despite his rudeness, you found a man you're happy with. Colin sounds like the kind of man that I'd want for you. Loving and understanding of your infirmity. I do hope the 2 of you are very happy together. Please keep in touch, as I like to always keep up with my brides. I want to make sure you remain happy in your marriage. Your friend, Elizabeth." Elaine smiled as she reread the letter, folding it back along the creases. She would start a box to keep all the letters from home that were worth keeping in. Pushing Elizabeth's letter to the side, she opened the letter from her mother, taking a deep breath to get up the courage to read the words that were written there. "Dear Elaine, I worry about you night and day. Thank you for sending a letter to let me know that you married. I hope that your husband is wealthy enough that he can provide a maid and cook for you, because you know as well as I do that you shouldn't be on your feet for longer than it takes to get out of bed and walk to the parlor to sew." Elaine looked around the tiny house she lived in with Colin, and thought about how upset her mother would be if she could see it. She didn't have a room that could even be jokingly called a parlor. "I hope to be able to travel out to see you and your new husband at Christmas time. I went to Elizabeth Miller's house to see if she'd received any word of you, and she informed me that you married a different man than you set out to marry. Did the first one realize that you were too weak to be able to keep house for him? Is that what happened? I understand your new husband's name is Colin Monroe, but that's really all I know about him. Why didn't you tell me that you married another man? You shouldn't hide things like this from your mother. I dedicated the last 12 years of my life to keeping you safe from harm, and that's the thanks I get? You don't tell me that you go to another state to marry one man and end up married to another? I certainly hope he has a maid to help you, because if you're doing the heavy chores around the house, you'll be worthless to your husband in a matter of weeks, and you know it as well as I do. Why don't you ever listen to me? You should have stayed home where you were safe instead of running off to Kansas of all places. Have the Indians come after you yet? Please tell me your husband doesn't leave you alone all day where you could be hurt by savages. Oh, I'll worry until I come out there and see for myself. Expect me at Christmas time. I'll send a letter with my exact arrival time as soon as I can. Love, Mother." Elaine folded the letter up and put her head down on the table, crying silently. What was it about her mother that always made her feel about 3 inches tall? Why could she not see that Elaine was stronger and more capable than she gave her credit for? Chapter 6. Elaine didn't know how much time had passed before she got up and put the letters in her drawer in the bedroom under her nightgowns. She knew Colin would never look there, and she wasn't ready for him to know just how much her mother had babied her and how she would look down on him and what he provided for her. She worked hard to keep from crying as the day progressed, although she kept thinking about her mother's words. She didn't want her to come to Kansas. She would take one look at the small house she shared with Colin and say it wasn't good enough. She was walking better than she'd walked in ages, because she had strengthened her leg through a lot of use. Her back would get sore by the end of the day because of the disparity in the length of her legs, but she felt better than she had in years. When Colin came into the house at the end of the day, he could see that she was extremely upset and knew it must be one of the letters she'd received. He washed his hands, soaping them long and thoroughly before sitting down at the table. Did Elizabeth say if she'd send another bride out to John? He knew it would upset her if another woman were sent to Kansas to be treated the way she had been treated. She put the pork roast on the table in front of him and brought over a bowl of mashed potatoes. No, she won't. She thanked me for telling her what happened and said that John wouldn't get a bride through her agency. Colin nodded. That's good news. I'd hate to think what he'd be like if another less than perfect woman came out here to marry him. He watched as she took the spot across from him and took her hand, bowing his head for their prayer. So what did your mother have to say? If it wasn't Elizabeth, it had to be her mother. He hoped there had been no deaths or illnesses in the family, but judging by Elaine's face, he expected the worst. Elaine felt the tears prick her eyes at his question. I'd rather not talk about Mother's letter. How could she tell him that her mother found her deficient in every way? If he couldn't see for himself that she wasn't good enough for him, she wasn't about to be the one to tell him. Was someone ill? Was there a death in the family? His voice was full of worry for her, and she smiled. No, just the usual nonsense from my mother. She smiled at how concerned he was. It was nice to be the center of his world the way she was. No one else had ever acted as if she were that important. I hope you know that you're the perfect bride for me, no matter what your mother's letter might say. He took a forkful of mashed potatoes and brought them to his lips. I think your leg is getting stronger with all the work you're doing as well. He tried not to bring her leg up often, but he felt that in this case, it was necessary. Her mother didn't really have anything else to denigrate her for that he knew of. Elaine didn't answer, but instead she toyed with the food on her plate, not feeling any great appetite. Rebecca and Laura invited us to have Thanksgiving with their parents. They said it would be really nice to have a decent pie for a change. She hoped he'd want to go. It would be fun to be with her new friends for the holiday. Colin accepted her change of subject, but he couldn't help but watch her to see if she was all right. Finally, he nodded. I think that would be all right. It would be nice to have a lot of people around for the holiday. He took a sip of water. Will it bother you to spend Christmas with just the two of us? He watched her carefully, knowing that if she said it would bother her, he'd throw a party for all of Kansas City on Christmas Day just to keep her happy. She shook her head. Mother says she'll be here for Christmas, so we won't be alone. I don't know if that means she'll bring the entire family or just come on her own. She didn't mention that she didn't want her mother to even think about coming. She didn't want her there at all. How would she be able to keep her newfound confidence with her mother there trying to tear her down? I can understand if she wants to meet me. I wouldn't want my daughter to be married to someone I'd never met. He hoped that was the only thing her mother had said to upset her, but judging by the look on her face, he doubted that was the case. She nodded. Honestly, I can understand that. She doesn't think I should be married to a man who doesn't have the money to hire a maid because standing to cook and clean is too much for me. She made a face. I hate that she treats me like an invalid. I'm a strong, capable woman, but after reading her letter, I feel like I should give up and just sit and sew for the rest of my life, which is exactly what she wants me to do. After reading that letter, I feel even worse about not being able to clean the floors myself. It's like she just drove home the point that I'm not good enough or whole enough to be a good wife, and I never will be. She felt the tears trickling down her face as she said the words to him, knowing there's no way he could understand the emotions involved. Colin shook his head. I wish you could see yourself through my eyes. I couldn't have sat down and written out the qualities I wanted in a wife and had someone create her for me, and come up with someone better than you. You are the wife I wanted and needed. I wouldn't change anything about you. She truly was the wife he'd needed his entire life. How could she not see that? Elaine took in a shaky breath and released it slowly. It really doesn't bother you that I drag my leg around? How could it not bother him when it bothered everyone else she knew? It never has. I wouldn't have wanted a woman who was perfect, because I'm not perfect myself. He couldn't imagine how a perfect woman would react to him and all of his flaws. He knew Elaine appreciated him, but she only did because she was flawed herself. He wouldn't have changed her flaws for anything, because they made her who she was. Elaine smiled at that. That's not what people around town say. They all sing your praises. I think you're pretty darn special myself. He blushed, which was something she'd never seen before. Do you get embarrassed when people say good things about you? Really? She didn't know why she found so much pleasure in his embarrassment, but she did. I don't know who you've been talking to, but I'm far from perfect. If I'd been perfect, I'd have helped you find a place to live so you could slowly get to know people in town instead of marrying you right off. That was selfish of me. You maybe would have found a man with enough money that you could have had a maid and a cook. He felt guilty for not doing just that. He knew it would have been the right thing to do even at the time, but he'd taken one look at her and wanted her for his wife, and done all he could to make it happen. I didn't want either of those things. I like cooking and cleaning for you. How could he not realize that with as hard as she worked to cater to his every whim? But your mother is right. You weren't raised to do those things. You had an easier life growing up. He should have left her to her life of leisure, but it was too late now. Even if divorce was acceptable, he'd never be able to let her go. His feelings for her were much too strong. She shook her head. My life was too easy growing up. I honestly loved to go play at a friend's house and help with the chores. I've always enjoyed cooking and have spent countless hours in the kitchen with our family cook learning everything I can about it. It makes me happy. Cooking for him made her even happier, though, because he appreciated every little thing she did a great deal. It was as if every small act of service for him was equivalent to climbing a mountain in his eyes. I hope you still feel that way in 5 years when we have children, and you're working nonstop cooking and cleaning while taking care of a little one or two. He grinned as he pictured it in his mind. She'd have a toddler clinging to her skirts while she worked, and a baby lying in the bassinet off to one side of the room. He'd need to build a bigger house. She smiled. Right now that sounds like heaven to me. When it actually happens, I may feel differently. She loved the idea of holding his child. He laughed. Yes, you might. I hope not, though, because I love the idea of you being surrounded by our children and baking a cake. You make the best cakes. He smiled and looked at her as if he expected her to magically pull a cake from behind her back. I didn't bake a cake for dessert tonight. I'm sorry. She knew he'd be let down, and her eyes danced with mischief as she told him there was no cake. His face fell. That's okay. I understand you didn't have time, what with the trip to town and everything. He couldn't believe how disappointed he was. She'd made a dessert for him every evening since he'd told her he had a sweet tooth. He knew he shouldn't expect it of her, but she always had one waiting. Elaine got up and walked to the oven, opening it and removing the pie she'd baked. I'm going to teach the ladies to bake pies next week, and I've never actually done one on my own from crust to filling, so I thought I should practice. She put the cherry pie on the table and cut a slice for him. I did have to buy the cherries already canned, but I had to add my own sugar to make it just right. She loved the look on his face as she brought the pie out, and he saw she hadn't forgotten his dessert after all. She sat down with her own piece and waited as he took a bite, knowing she wanted to see his face as he took the first bite. He closed his eyes and savored the taste, chewing slowly and methodically. "It's so shocking to me that you can cook and bake the way you do when your mother never allowed you in the kitchen." His tongue went out to catch a stray bit of cherry from his lip as he devoured his pie as quickly as he could. Elaine laughed. "She left the house a lot, and I would sneak into the kitchen and sit with our cook and help her. It gave me something to do, and I enjoyed the cook's company a great deal." She smiled as she mentioned Mrs. Jenkins and all she'd taught her behind her mother's back. Why, she wouldn't even know how to wash dishes if it hadn't been for Mrs. Jenkins. He chuckled. "That explains it all. Thank you for being a disobedient daughter and learning the skills I needed in a wife." He winked at her as he said the words to let her know he didn't think she'd been terribly disobedient after all. After supper, he dried the dishes for her, despite her complaints. "I can help you if I want to. I know you're perfectly capable of doing it yourself, but it doesn't make me any less of a man to dry the dishes for my wife." Once he would have thought that it would unman him, but he'd learned a lot from her in the past few weeks, all lessons he hadn't realized he needed to learn. She sighed. "Just so you know that I can do it, I guess it's all right. I just think you should be able to sit back and relax after working all day." It always made her feel like he didn't think she was capable when he helped, though. She wasn't certain why, but she'd rather he calmly sat and watched her clean as he did most nights. "Well, I know how I want to relax tonight, and it's not sitting at the table. I can't relax the way I want until my wife is done with her chores for the day." He waggled his eyebrows at her, letting her know just what kind of relaxation he meant. She laughed. "You know you are absolutely insatiable. How can I keep a man who only thinks of being in bed happy?" She shook her head at him while she laughed, letting him know that she loved how much he wanted her. "Go to bed with him, of course. But that's not fair anyway. I think of a lot more than being in bed. I think of cakes and pies and cookies and cinnamon rolls. I think of cinnamon rolls a lot." He licked his lips as if he could taste the cinnamon rolls. "But I've never made you cinnamon rolls." She looked at him questioningly. He pouted, looking at her with pleading eyes. "I know. I'm heartbroken over that fact." She sighed. "Cinnamon rolls, huh? I guess I'll make something new." She shook her head. "A woman might think that you only married her for her cooking ability and bedroom willingness. No. There's more, I'll let you know when I remember what it is." He winked at her as she laughed. Elaine made double the dough she usually made for bread the following afternoon, knowing she was going to use about half of it for cinnamon rolls. She couldn't resist her husband. She'd already made 2 new kinds of pies and had them resting on the work table. One was apple, and one was blueberry. He would be in sweets heaven when he got home and saw what she'd been working on all day. She hummed a little tune as she rolled out the dough for the cinnamon rolls, standing beside the table, when the door slammed open loudly, banging against the wall. She looked up, startled. Colin wasn't due back for several hours, and she had never heard him slam anything. He was too gentle for that. Her face drained of color when she saw who was there. "John." She swallowed hard as she looked up into his angry eyes. He must have heard back from Elizabeth and blamed her for whatever had been said. "John. How can I help you?" She didn't let her eyes drift over to where the shotgun was, but she was happy she had a rolling pin in her hand. It may be a cliché female weapon, but it was sturdy, and she could defend herself with it if need be. "Did you tell the mail-order bride woman not to send me another bride? Why are you trying to ruin my life?" He stalked across the room toward her, and she held tightly to the rolling pin in her hand, afraid but not willing to show it. Every time I turn around you're acting like you're better than me somehow. You won't give me the biggest piece of cake. You tell your friend not to send me another bride. Did you forget that I paid for your train ticket out here? I'd be happy to reimburse you for the train ticket. Do you remember what it cost? She asked, hoping that would appease him. I don't want the money. I want a wife. How are you going to get me a wife? John's voice had raised in volume to the point where she was certain he was out of control. He was obviously very angry with her. I did not tell her not to send you another bride. I did tell her what happened between us, and she came to her own conclusions about sending you another bride. She kept her voice calm, and even as she spoke to him, trying to keep him from getting even angrier than he already was. An angry John was not something she wanted in her home while Colin was out on the range. She had no idea if he was close enough to hear her scream, and was too afraid of angering John more to try it. He walked around the table, glaring at her. You come out here, with your limp and your innocent eyes, and keep me from getting a wife. Who do you think you are that you get to do that? He looked over at the work table. By all rights those pies should be mine. I shouldn't have to beg to get a small piece of cake that Colin decides is good enough for me. Elaine watched him stalk across the room. She followed him toward the work table. I could get you a piece of pie if you'd like. She still clutched the rolling pin, knowing she wasn't close enough to the shotgun to grab it and do herself any good at all. If only she were faster on her feet. He grabbed the rolling pin from her hand while she was distracted and threw it across the room. He sat down at the table and smiled at her. Yes, get me a piece of pie. Just like you get Colin pie and cake and whatever else he wants. Elaine served him a piece of pie and went back to the work table. She inched toward the shotgun. She didn't feel safe being there alone with him, even though he hadn't really done anything threatening except act strangely and yell a bit. Of course, he'd stolen her only protection from her, but did that mean he planned to hurt her? He watched her. You going to try to get that gun? I promise you, I'm a lot faster than you are. He looked at her for a moment as if seeing her for the first time. You know, I never noticed it before, but you are a pretty little thing. I think I see what Colin likes about you. He stood up and walked toward her, his eyes filled with anger. Elaine put one hand, unnoticed, on the only weapon she had access to. John strode toward her and put an arm around her waist and started to draw her towards him roughly. With a flash, she shoved her weapon into his face. He staggered backward a couple of steps, trying to clear cooked blueberry and dough from his eyes while she scrambled toward the gun. By the time he could see clearly, he was staring into the barrel of a loaded shotgun. She could see that he was shocked a lame woman like she had been able to move so quickly. Huh. You think you scare me with that thing? I'm surprised you even know which way to point it, you stupid, gimpy woman. You don't have the gumption to shoot a squirrel. He reached toward her, making it clear that she was either going to have to shoot him, or he was going to take her weapon away. Elaine knew he was right. She didn't want to shoot anyone. But she also knew that she was finally with a good man, and she wasn't willing to let anyone take her happiness away from her. She closed her eyes as she squeezed the trigger, saying a silent prayer that she'd hurt him enough to keep him from coming after her, but not enough to kill him. She didn't want to kill anyone. John was laughing as he lunged toward her. The taunting smile was frozen on his face as the report of the gun blast coincided with blood gushing from his chest. Laughter turned to shock as he looked down at his chest, clutching it as he collapsed to the floor. The little gimp had killed him. Colin was mending fences, once of his least favorite chores on the ranch, when he heard a single shotgun blast. He felt a sense of dread wash over him as he immediately thought of Elaine and that idiot John. He had no way of knowing whether it was her or not, but he had to assume it was. Without thinking, he jumped on his horse and began running full speed back toward the house. Even if nothing was wrong, He'd rather look like an idiot than have his wife hurt while he just stood there and kept working. He prayed the whole way. Elaine had removed her apron and was applying pressure to the wound as best she could, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. Not that it would do any good. She couldn't get him into town by herself. She knew that no matter how hard she tried, this man was going to die, and she knew it was her fault. The tears rolled down her cheeks as she fought to save him. He was a bad man, but no one deserved to die in such a brutal way. She would never be able to live with herself if he died. She knew she was sobbing, but she couldn't help it. Colin heard her sobs from outside, and was thrilled she was alive, but more worried than ever. Was she lying on the floor injured? He opened the door and froze. He realized immediately what must have happened, but he was torn between letting the jackass die and helping his wife save his miserable hide. His decision was made for him when she pleaded, "Help me." He couldn't let him die and force his wife to live with the guilt that came with killing a man. Her tear-ravaged face spurred him into action. A few minutes later, John was loaded in the back of the wagon, and they were headed to town. Colin drove as fast as he could while Elaine knelt in the back, applying pressure to John's wounds. Her knee was screaming at her to get up, but she couldn't. If she had to do herself further injury to save a man's life, then she had no choice. Her pain was nothing in comparison to the sanctity of life. Colin pulled up in front of the doctor's office and yelled at a man standing on the boardwalk, just staring at them. "Help me with him." Why did people stand like they were idiots in a crisis? The two worked together to carry John inside, while Elaine sat in the back of the wagon, her face in her hands, and her entire body covered with blood. She was shaking dramatically with the sobs that racked her body. She knew that she would have to burn everything she was wearing, because there was nothing she could do for the blood stains that covered the front of her dress. How could she ever look at the garment again and not thinking of taking a man's life? Colin left John with the doctor and ran back out to his wife, gathering her against him and holding her tightly. "Did he hurt you?" He couldn't believe he'd been so focused on John that H hadn't thought to ask his wife if she'd been injured yet. What was his problem? Elaine sniffled and shook her head. No. He didn't get the chance. She could see that Colin was worried, but she was fine. What's the blue all over his face? He looked like he's covered in blueberries. He was confused as to what had happened to the other man. The blue couldn't have been from the shotgun blast, though. Elaine's eyes met his, and she inappropriately felt laughter building up inside her. "He took my rolling pin away and told me I'd never reach the shotgun before he did. He tried to touch me, so I threw a pie in his face, and while he was getting the blueberry out of his eyes, I ran for the gun." She couldn't figure out why she suddenly found the way she'd protected herself so amusing, but she did. Colin pulled her face into his chest and stroked her hair, which had come out of its usually neat knot and was cascading down her back. "You did the right thing. But did you have to use my pie? Blueberry's my favorite." He shook his head, wondering why after the chaotic events of the day, he was worried about a lost pie. Elaine let out a wild giggle. "I knew it would keep him from being able to see. Besides, I'd already given him a piece of the apple." She thought about the cinnamon rolls that were ruined as well. "I was making you cinnamon rolls, but he came in without knocking." He was angry because Elizabeth told him she wouldn't send him another bride, and he acted crazy. She shuddered, clinging to Colin, putting weight on her leg for the first time since she'd knelt the whole way to town, surprised that it held her. Colin looked down at her, his eyes searching hers. "You're sure he didn't hurt you?" He would go into the doctor's office and strangle him if he'd hurt her in any way. No man should ever touch his wife, but him. She shook her head. "No, he didn't. My leg hurts a lot now, because I knelt the whole way into town, but he never had a chance to hurt me." She sighed. "I hope he lives." I hate the idea that I could have killed a man. Even a man like John, who really wouldn't be missed by anyone? Colin shook his head at her soft-heartedness, but he knew that if she were any other way, he wouldn't love her nearly as much as he did. Elaine nodded. Even a man like John. He must have a mother somewhere. She looked toward the doctor's office, wondering what was going on. Do you think he'll live? She hoped he would, even if it was just to stand trial for his crimes. She didn't want to be responsible for his death. Colin shrugged. I really don't know. Let's go talk to the doc and find out. He had his arm firmly around her shoulders as he led her into the doctor's office. John was laid out on the table and had been stripped to the waist while the doctor used a tweezers to pluck the shot from his chest. You the one who shot him? The doctor looked up at her as she stepped into the room, obviously curious about a woman who could shoot a man. Yes, I shot him. He was going to hurt me. Elaine clenched her hands together. You saved his life too, keeping him from bleeding more. You did a good job. I'm almost done here, but I'm sure he'll live. Of course, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison after what he tried to do to you, but that's better than dead, right? He took out the last of the shots and dropped the tweezers. He walked to the sink and washed his hands using soap and water. Thank you for helping him, Elaine whispered. She was too shocked by what had happened to know what to say. The doctor had automatically believed her story, which surprised her a little. John must truly have a bad reputation in town for everyone to believe a newcomer like her, without even letting him tell his side of things. How long will he have to stay here? She asked. The doctor shrugged. With his history, I'm sure the sheriff is going to come get him and take him off to stay in the jail. I'll check on him, but they won't want him to stay here at all. The doctor seemed to think that was for the best. He obviously didn't want John around any longer than necessary. Will I need to talk to the sheriff? The doctor nodded. That's a good idea. Just go do it now and get it over with. No one is going to be surprised, considering who was shot. John's not exactly an upstanding citizen. Colin led her out of the office and down the street toward the sheriff's office. Is your leg going to support you? Or do you want me to get the wagon and drive you? He kept his arm around her waist as they walked, obviously afraid to let her get more than a few steps from him. I can walk. I'm really surprised that it's holding up as well as it is. I think all the exercise it gets from cooking and cleaning has been good for it. She was so glad he was holding her so closely, though. She wasn't sure her legs would carry her otherwise, and it had nothing to do with her injury. She was still feeling very shaky after the events of the day. He opened the door to the sheriff's office for her, and Sheriff Goodman took one look at the state of Elaine's dress and got to his feet. What happened? Elaine sank into the chair in front of his desk and took a deep breath. I need to start at the beginning. Her hand automatically went to her bad leg, massaging it through her dress. The sheriff held up a hand. Sounds like a long story. I need to know if there's anyone dead or if I need to get the doc before you start. Colin shook his head. No one's dead, and the injured man is with the doc now. Colin answered the questions quickly, knowing the sheriff wouldn't be able to listen to the story his wife was about to tell him if he had to worry about whether or not a man was dying. Sheriff Goodman took his seat and propped his hands under his chin with his elbows on his desk. Take your time, then. Near the beginning of October, I answered an advertisement to be a mail-order bride, back in my hometown of Beckham, Massachusetts. She went on to explain how she'd answered John's letter and what had happened when she arrived. She told him how she'd ended up marrying Colin instead. All the details of the story came rushing out of her mouth, while Colin sat beside her holding her hand for support. It wasn't until the events of that day were recounted that Colin's jaw clenched. It's a good thing you'd already shot him when I got there, because I'd have killed him with my bare hands. He was angry that he hadn't had a chance to pound some sense into the other man. He wished their sheriff wasn't such a good man, because he'd have loved the opportunity to pummel John into a bloody pulp. The sheriff looked at Colin. "Enough from you." He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Doc says John is going to live?" Elaine nodded. "Yes, he thinks he's going to live." She didn't have to say how relieved she was by that fact, because it showed clearly all over her face. "I'll get him transferred to my jail as soon as he's well enough for it." He stood up and walked around the desk. "I know it's hard to shoot a man, but you did the right thing. No one in town is going to be surprised that John tried to hurt a lady. He'll be spending a long time behind bars. Don't you worry about that." He looked over at Colin. "You've got a fine wife here. You the one who taught her to shoot?" Colin nodded. "I was worried about what John might do." He didn't tell the sheriff how proud he was that Elaine had been able to keep her head together enough to follow his instructions. He knew it went without saying. His wife was a truly amazing woman. Good job. I wish all men would teach their women how to take control of a situation like that. Elaine smiled. "I'm truly blessed that John rejected me and Colin married me instead." She squeezed Colin's hand, knowing his support had gotten her through the telling of the story. She didn't know what she'd done in life to deserve such a good man, but she was glad she had him. The sheriff shook his head. "I don't think you have any idea how blessed you really are. Let me know where you live, and I'll ride out there if I have any other questions for you. I think this case is clear as can be, though. You have nothing to worry about, Mrs. Monroe." Sheriff Goodman held his hand out to shake Colin's. Colin shook the older man's hand, feeling relieved that going over the whole thing was finally over. Elaine got to her feet shakily, and immediately Colin came up behind her to support her. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked. He led her out the door and onto the street. He couldn't wait to get her home, so he could hold her and make certain she really was all right. She nodded, leaning heavily against him. "Oh, no. I didn't make supper." How could she have forgotten to feed him? She knew it wasn't really her fault, but she hadn't even thought about it through the chaos of the day. Colin laughed and shook his head. "You had more important things on your mind." He looked at the restaurant across the street and back at her. "We could go to the restaurant." He didn't mind eating there often as long as she was feeling up to going. She looked down at her dress and back at him. "I doubt if they'd even let me in looking this way." They did need to eat, though, and she had nothing she could fix terribly quickly unless he wanted breakfast foods. "I can make bacon and eggs or pancakes," she suggested. Colin frowned for a moment. "They have ready-made dresses at the Mercantile. Let's see if there's something that will suit you." He didn't even want to think of what a ready-made dress would cost, but just then he didn't care. He needed her to be comfortable, and he knew she wouldn't be as long as she was wearing a dress splattered with John's blood. They went into the Mercantile, and Mr. Judd rushed out from behind the counter. "Are you hurt?" His eyes traveled up and down Elaine, searching for an injury. Colin shook his head. "No, she's fine. We need a ready-made dress, though. Have you got anything in her size?" He looked around for the dresses he'd seen there before. The shopkeeper looked her up and down for a moment before he went over to his display of dresses. "I think this will fit her just fine." He handed them a pretty dress with pink flowers on it. Elaine accepted it and his invitation to go into the back room to change. The blood had soaked into her corset and petticoat, but she knew that she could leave them in the sun to be bleached back to a perfect white. She changed quickly and looked into the mirror hanging on the wall. Good. The blood didn't show through. She did her best to put her hair back into its usual knot before leaving the back room. It wasn't easy without a brush, but she wasn't about to buy a brush when she had a perfectly good one at home. She'd grabbed her purse before leaving and walked to the counter, paying for her dress before Colin had a chance. "Would you burn my old dress, Mr. Judd? I left it in the back room." Even touching it again would upset her, and she just didn't want to have to do it. The older man nodded, exchanging a look with Colin that let her know that her husband had explained what happened. She left, holding on to his arm. "Thank you for letting me pay for my own dress." She had expected him to argue, but was thrilled when he hadn't. He sighed. "If I'd thought to bring any money, I wouldn't have." He shook his head, annoyed at his own lack of foresight. "I know, but it was only right that I pay for it because it's my fault I was covered in blood." She tried to reason with him, so he wouldn't mind that she'd paid. "How was it your fault?" He couldn't see how that would make sense to anyone but her. "Well, a normal person would have left him there to bleed to death. Then we just would have had to scrub the floor, which wouldn't have messed up my dress." Elaine shrugged as she said the words, knowing they were the truth. "You wouldn't be you if you had let him die. I married a special woman, and I'm so glad I did." Colin held the door for the restaurant for her, taking her to a table in the corner of the room. For the first time, Elaine believed his words. He really did love her. He'd never said one word against her and the way she'd killed John. She'd felt so weak and helpless when it came to being a wife, but she wasn't. She'd not only shown that she was a good wife and cook, but she had saved herself rather than standing around and waiting for Colin to rescue her.